I stood silently in the corner of the most exclusive bridal boutique in Savannah, watching my older sister Miranda twirl before the mirrors in a handcrafted lace gown that cost more than most people earn in a year. My name is Sydney. I am 26 years old, and as a professional trust fund manager, I have spent my entire adult life meticulously cleaning up the disastrous financial messes my family constantly creates, while they treat me like an invisible servant. Miranda adjusted her veil and caught my reflection in the glass, her eyes narrowing with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain as she took in my simple office attire and the complete lack of expensive jewelry on my person. She didn't even try to lower her voice when she turned to the boutique staff and declared that someone as worthless and penniless as me should never even dream of touching a masterpiece like the one she was wearing. Standing right beside her, her fiancé Trevor let out a mocking laugh while adding that these kinds of luxuries were strictly reserved for people of a much higher social standing than myself. My parents stood only a few feet away, yet neither of them uttered a single word to defend me, and I actually saw my mother nod in silent agreement with Miranda's cruel remarks, as if my presence was an embarrassment to their public image. Instead of wasting my breath on a useless argument, I remained perfectly calm and reached into my bag to check the legal documents that would soon turn their entire world into a pile of ashes. Miranda looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you don't have the money, then don't even dream about this dress," while Trevor sneered, "Someone like you simply doesn't deserve luxury." Before I reveal how I stripped every single one of them of their dignity and their bank accounts, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the high-stakes justice that is about to unfold. 2 days before this bridal fitting took place, I spent hours locked in my private office reviewing the latest financial reports of the family estate. As the sole manager of the trust fund established by my late grandmother, it was my legal responsibility to ensure every dollar was accounted for and protected from reckless spending. My eyes burned from staring at the spreadsheets until a glaring inconsistency in the general ledger caught my immediate attention during the midnight hours. I discovered that my father, Robert, had secretly withdrawn $15,000 from the emergency reserve fund by claiming the money was intended for urgent roof repairs on the family estate. However, the internal bank records clearly showed that the entire sum had been funneled directly into several high-end boutiques to pay off Miranda's personal shopping invoices. While I was still processing this blatant act of financial betrayal, my mother Martha called my private line for the 3rd time that morning. She began the conversation by demanding that I immediately authorize a massive increase in the budget for the wedding cocktail hour scheduled for next Friday night. Mom spoke with a sense of entitlement that completely ignored the current state of our declining liquid assets or the strict rules of the trust agreement. She didn't bother to ask how I was doing. Instead, she spent 10 minutes describing the imported crystal glassware and rare vintage wines she wanted to impress the guests with. When I tried to explain that the fund was not a bottomless well for social vanity, she simply sighed in frustration and told me that my cold obsession with numbers was ruining the most important event of the decade. Later that afternoon, my investigation into the family's fiscal health uncovered a much darker secret buried within a pile of neglected tax documents. I found an official notice from the government stating that Robert owed a staggering amount in unpaid penalties due to several failed private real estate investments he had hidden from me for years. It became painfully clear that during the past decade, I had been viewed by my parents only as an unpaid financial tool to clean up the disastrous messes they left behind in their pursuit of status. They expected me to navigate the complex legal waters and shield them from the consequences of their own poor choices, while they offered me nothing but disdain in return. The more I searched through the digital archives, the more I realized that the situation was approaching a critical breaking point that could destroy us all. Miranda's reckless spending on her secondary credit cards had finally hit the maximum red limit, creating a direct threat to the long-term safety of the trust fund. My grandmother had intended this wealth to provide security for future generations, not to be set on fire by a sister who refused to hold a real job. The sheer lack of respect for the rules of the inheritance made my blood boil as I watched the numbers on the screen dwindle toward zero. I knew that if I did not act with absolute authority immediately, there would be nothing left to save by the time the wedding bells rang. The weight of this realization forced me to stop playing the role of the obedient daughter and finally assume the role of a strict legal executor. I spent the next hour drafting a formal and final warning email addressed to both Robert and Martha regarding the immediate suspension of their beneficiary rights. I stated clearly that any further acts of financial fraud or unauthorized withdrawals would result in a total freeze of their monthly stipends without any possibility of appeal. I attached the evidence of the missing $15,000 and the tax delinquency notices to ensure they understood the gravity of the legal situation they were facing. After hitting the send button, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me because the time for polite warnings had officially come to an end. 3 days later, Trevor took the initiative to invite me to a secluded cafe on the outskirts of Savannah to discuss a stock investment project he described as a once-in-a-thousand-year opportunity. He greeted me with an overly rehearsed smile and immediately began using flowery language to convince me to sign a power of attorney document. Trevor claimed that this signature would grant him access to the long-term investment portfolio of the family trust so he could maximize our returns through his exclusive connections. I sat across from him and listened to his grandiose promises about doubling the family wealth within a single fiscal quarter while I sipped my coffee in silence. To test his actual knowledge, I deliberately started asking highly technical questions about market volatility indexes and specific hedging strategies that any real expert would know by heart. It became painfully obvious within minutes that Trevor was completely clueless about the basic principles of high-level financial management. He stumbled over his words and tried to deflect my questions with vague platitudes about market intuition rather than providing any concrete data or risk assessment. His inability to explain the legal structure of his supposed investment vehicle proved that he was hiding a fraudulent scheme designed to drain the trust fund for his own benefit. Trevor leaned in closer and whispered with a manipulative tone, "You just need to sign here and the entire family will be 10 times wealthier." I looked directly into his eyes and replied, "I need to carefully review all the legal terms and conditions before making a final decision." Just as the tension between us began to peak, Miranda suddenly appeared at the cafe and sat down beside her fiancé with an aggressive expression on her face. She immediately started putting pressure on me by claiming that my constant hesitation was intentionally sabotaging her future happiness and financial security. Miranda accused me of being a bitter person who enjoyed making life difficult for her talented partner just because I lacked a romantic life of my own. While she continued her verbal assault, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Dad that I chose to answer right there at the table. He used a stern tone to remind me that Trevor was now considered a member of the family, and I was not allowed to act like a suspicious stranger toward him. Dad insisted that my lack of cooperation was causing unnecessary friction in the household during such a joyous wedding season. What neither of them realized was that I had already activated a secret recording device in my handbag the moment I arrived at the meeting. I remained calm as I steered the conversation toward Trevor's personal debts until he finally admitted that he intended to use a portion of the trust money to settle his private liabilities under the guise of an initial investment fee. This recording was the definitive evidence I needed to prove his criminal intent to both the bank and the other trustees of the estate. Miranda continued to glare at me with pure hatred, while Trevor tried to maintain his mask of professional confidence, unaware that his own words had just sealed his fate. Immediately after the meeting ended, I walked to my car and contacted Elena, my personal attorney and a trusted expert in white-collar crime. I explained the situation to her in detail and instructed her to begin a comprehensive federal background check to verify Trevor's criminal record across every state. Elena promised to prioritize the investigation and warned me to stay away from any further private meetings until we had the full report in our hands. I felt a surge of cold determination as I drove back to my office because I was no longer just a daughter or a sister. I was a protector of the legacy my grandmother had worked so hard to build. The predator thought he had found an easy target, but he was about to discover that I was the one who controlled every move on this financial chessboard. Early Wednesday morning, Elena sent me a thick digital dossier containing the horrifying truths about the past of the man who was preparing to marry into my family. The documents revealed that Trevor had previously been prosecuted for a massive multi-level marketing scam in California and was currently a person of interest in another active asset misappropriation case. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrolled through the long list of victims who had lost their life savings to his smooth-talking lies and fraudulent investment schemes. I knew that I had to act immediately to prevent Trevor from doing the same to my grandmother's legacy, while my family remained blinded by his fake charm. I wasted no time in executing an emergency suspension of benefits for every supplementary credit card I had previously issued to Miranda and my parents. This legal maneuver was designed to cut off their access to the trust's liquid assets before Trevor could convince them to make any more unauthorized withdrawals. I also contacted the legal department of our primary bank to officially report that Dad had forged my signature on several documents to perform illegal cash transfers. The bank manager assured me that they would flag Robert's personal accounts for suspicious activity and prevent any further tampering with the trust's main capital. While I was deep in the process of finalizing these protective measures, Miranda sent me a series of insulting text messages because her card had been declined while she was at a luxury spa. She accused me of being a jealous, petty thief who wanted to ruin her pre-wedding glow, but I chose to completely ignore her childish outbursts and focus on the legal paperwork. My phone suddenly rang with an aggressive call from my sister that demanded an immediate explanation for the sudden loss of her spending power. Miranda screamed through the phone, "What have you done with my card, you bitch?" I calmly replied, "The system is currently undergoing maintenance. You should just use your own cash for now." I quietly spent the rest of the afternoon transferring all the remaining cash from the family's joint checking account into a secure private vault that only I could access. This was a necessary step to ensure that my parents could not accidentally or intentionally hand over our family's survival money to a known felon like Trevor. Elena called me back an hour later to confirm that all the evidence I had gathered was more than enough to legally revoke the beneficiary rights of any family member who violated the ethical standards of the trust management. She reminded me that my grandmother had written a specific clause into the agreement to protect the wealth from exactly this type of predatory behavior and moral failure. My parents were still unaware of the financial fortress I was building around them, while they continued to plan an extravagant wedding they could no longer afford. I felt a cold sense of resolve as I organized the final set of restraining orders and financial injunctions that would be served at the upcoming rehearsal dinner. I was no longer interested in being the flexible daughter who looked the other way, while her family burned their future for the sake of temporary vanity. The battle lines had been clearly drawn in the sand of Savannah, and I was fully prepared to use every legal weapon in my arsenal to win this war. At 6 o'clock the following evening, the wedding rehearsal dinner was held at the most prestigious restaurant in Savannah, with the attendance of many prominent local families. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of forced laughter as my family attempted to maintain their facade of perfect wealth. Robert sat at the head of the long table, acting as if he still controlled a vast empire instead of a crumbling house of cards. When the time came to settle the initial deposit of $30,000 for the venue and catering services, Dad confidently pulled out the family's black credit card with a theatrical flourish. He handed it to the restaurant manager while continuing to boast about his recent investment successes to the distinguished guests sitting nearby. The manager returned a few minutes later with a deeply concerned expression on his face and leaned down to whisper something privately into Robert's ear. Dad's face immediately flushed a deep shade of crimson as the manager politely informed him that every single one of his cards had been decisively declined by the system. The quiet murmurs of the guests died down as they began to notice the awkward tension radiating from the head of the table where my father sat frozen in embarrassment. Miranda suddenly jumped to her feet and began to scream at the top of her lungs in the middle of the crowded dining room. She pointed a trembling finger at me and shouted that I had deliberately sabotaged her big day out of pure, pathetic jealousy. Her screeching voice echoed off the high ceilings as she accused me of being a cold-hearted sister who couldn't stand to see anyone else find true happiness or success. I remained perfectly calm and slowly stood up from my chair to command the full attention of everyone present in the room. I requested that the guests remain silent for a moment so that I could clarify the legal reality of the current situation regarding our family's finances. I officially announced my status as the sole executive director of the trust fund and explained that I had taken full control of all assets to prevent further criminal mismanagement. Dad stood up and shouted loudly, "What the hell are you doing, Sydney?" I looked him directly in the eye and replied, "I am protecting what is left before everyone throws it into Trevor's casino." My parents stood there completely speechless as I began to publicly disclose the staggering amounts of money they had secretly embezzled from the trust over the years. I presented a clear summary of the massive tax debts and legal penalties that Robert had been hiding behind his tailored suits and expensive cars. Martha looked like she was about to faint when I revealed that their lifestyle had been funded by fraudulent withdrawals that had nearly bankrupted the legacy my grandmother built. The distinguished guests began to whisper and exchange shocked glances as the truth about our family's hollow status and financial fraud became impossible to ignore. Miranda's face was a mask of pure rage and humiliation as she realized that her golden wedding was dissolving into a public scandal. The once elegant dinner party was quickly consumed by a thick sense of shame that no amount of expensive wine could wash away for my parents. I felt no guilt as I watched the masks of the Savannah elite slip away to reveal the desperate and greedy people underneath. My family had spent their entire lives demanding my silence and my labor to support their vanity, but that era had officially ended tonight. I signaled the manager to conclude the evening while the guests began to make their hurried exits to avoid being associated with our public downfall. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, leaving Robert and Miranda to face the consequences of the wreckage they had created through their own arrogance. Immediately after the guests departed in a state of utter bewilderment, I demanded a closed-door family meeting right inside the VIP lounge of the restaurant. The silence in the small room was heavy as I threw Elena's thick dossier onto the polished mahogany table and leaned forward with a gaze that demanded absolute honesty. I looked directly at Trevor and ordered him to explain the multi-level marketing fraud conviction he had received in the state of California exactly 3 years ago. Trevor tried to justify the situation by claiming it was merely a minor legal misunderstanding involving a former business partner, but his voice trembled noticeably as he saw the formal arrest warrant I was currently drafting on my laptop. Despite the overwhelming evidence lying right in front of her, Miranda continued to blindly defend her fiancé and accused me of forging the entire dossier just to tarnish the reputation of the man she loved. She screamed that I was a bitter woman who was willing to commit a crime of defamation just to satisfy my own petty grievances against her. To silence her, I pulled out my phone and played the crystal-clear recording of Trevor admitting his plan to embezzle my grandmother's trust money to pay off his mounting private debts. The sound of his own voice confessing to the financial plot caused Mom and Dad to grow pale as they realized they had almost handed their entire future to a professional criminal. Trevor glared at me and growled with a tone of pure malice, Do you really think you can win against me? I looked back at him with a cold expression and replied, You aren't fighting me. You are fighting the laws of the United States. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when the local police officers I had contacted earlier suddenly appeared at the door to request Trevor's cooperation in an active federal investigation regarding interstate financial fraud. They informed him that his recent attempts to access the family trust fund had triggered multiple red flags in the national banking security system. Trevor was handcuffed in front of everyone, his mask of charm finally slipping away to reveal the desperate and defeated predator underneath. Miranda collapsed completely onto the floor in a heap of expensive silk, sobbing hysterically, as she realized that her $10,000 wedding dress was now nothing more than a symbol of her own stupidity and utter financial ruin. Robert and Martha sat frozen in their chairs as they watched the man they had praised for months being led away in shame by the authorities. The reality of their own near destruction began to sink in, while I stood over them with the finality of a judge who had just delivered a life-altering verdict. There was no more room for excuses or fake apologies, because every bridge back to their old lifestyle of vanity and deception had been burned to the ground. I felt a profound sense of relief as the police vehicle drove away, leaving behind a family that was finally forced to face the truth of their own greed and incompetence. The golden wedding had turned into a dark lesson about the cost of betrayal, and I was the only one who remained standing among the wreckage of their broken dreams. 1 week after the disaster at the rehearsal dinner, I stood before the family mansion in Savannah and watched the bank officials place official foreclosure seals on the main entrance. The grand estate that once symbolized our family's social standing was now being seized to cover the massive tax debts and illegal mortgage loans Robert had signed in secret. I remained an observer from the sidewalk as the moving trucks arrived to haul away the luxury furniture that had been purchased with stolen trust funds. It was a cold but necessary conclusion to the years of financial deception that had hollowed out our family's legacy from the inside. My father stood on the lawn with his head bowed in defeat as the reality of losing his pride and his home finally began to settle into his weary eyes. The social fallout was just as devastating for Miranda, who found herself completely blacklisted by the elite circles of Savannah after the scandal became public knowledge. She was forced to sell every designer handbag and expensive dress in her collection just to afford the security deposit on a tiny apartment in the suburbs. The invitations to high society galas and exclusive parties stopped arriving immediately as her former friends chose to distance themselves from the shame of her failed wedding. Miranda sent me a frantic text message late that evening that said, "Please, Sydney, we are family, after all." I looked at the glowing screen for a long moment and silently told myself that family would never humiliate or deceive each other in the cruel way she had done for years. While my sister struggled with her new reality, Martha continued to send me tearful letters begging for forgiveness and immediate financial support to maintain her lifestyle. She claimed that she was a victim of Robert's poor choices, yet she never mentioned her own role in demanding the extravagant luxuries that led to our ruin. I decided to remain silent and refuse to respond to any form of communication from my parents as they faced the consequences of their actions. My decision was not rooted in malice, but in a firm belief that they needed to experience the true cost of their vanity without my intervention. Trevor was eventually sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for financial fraud, which brought a definitive end to his dreams of getting rich through illegal shortcuts. My parents were now forced to accept physically demanding manual labor jobs in their twilight years just to maintain a minimum standard of living after wasting a lifetime of wealth. The sight of Robert working as a low-level clerk and Martha handling service tasks was a jarring contrast to the royal image they had carefully projected for decades. I spent my final afternoon in the city completing the legal paperwork to transfer the management of the remaining trust assets to an independent fiduciary firm. This act officially severed every remaining bond I had with the people who had viewed me only as a financial tool for their own selfish gain. I walked away from the lawyer's office with a profound sense of freedom that I had never experienced during my years of service to their greed. The shadow of the mansion was no longer looming over my future as I prepared to start a new life where my worth was not defined by the numbers in a ledger. 1 month after all those horrific events unfolded, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment in a different city while breathing in the air of true freedom. The crushing weight that had sat on my shoulders for decades finally vanished because I was no longer responsible for the financial survival of people who only saw me as a source of capital. It was an incredible relief to wake up every morning without receiving a single demanding phone call or an insulting text message from Miranda or my parents. I had spent so much of my youth acting as a reluctant shield for their vanity and poor decisions, but that chapter of my life was officially closed. My new home was much smaller than the mansion in Savannah, yet every corner of this space belonged to me and represented a peace that money could never buy. I began building my own career by relying solely on my professional financial expertise without the need for a famous family name or an elite social background to open doors. My new clients respected me for my analytical skills and my unwavering integrity rather than the prestige of my former life in the high society circles of Georgia. This fresh start allowed me to prove that my success was never a result of luck, but a product of hard work and a deep understanding of the global markets. I felt a renewed sense of purpose as I developed investment strategies that prioritized transparency and long-term security for people who truly valued my advice. My colleagues here did not know about the public scandal that had destroyed Robert's reputation, and I preferred to keep my past private while I focused on the future. My firm determination to maintain a complete lack of contact with my family helped me find a lasting inner calm after years of being a victim of their psychological manipulation. I ignored the filtered updates about their struggles because I understood that their current hardship was a direct consequence of their own greed and lack of empathy toward me. Instead of dwelling on the betrayal, I started dedicating my spare time to volunteering for local organizations that supported victims of financial fraud. I shared the lessons I had learned from my experience with Trevor to help other vulnerable individuals protect their assets from smooth-talking predators who preyed on the innocent. This work provided me with a different kind of wealth that was measured in the gratitude and resilience of the people I assisted every week. My new life was certainly more modest in its presentation, but it was filled with genuine respect from real friends and honest associates who valued my character above my bank balance. I no longer had to wear a mask of perfection to satisfy the expectations of a community that only cared about appearances and social rankings. The evenings were spent enjoying quiet dinners with people who actually listened to my thoughts and supported my personal growth without any hidden agendas. I often stood by the railing of my balcony and looked toward the horizon with a quiet smile while the sun dipped below the city skyline. I represented a new generation of modern women who knew exactly how to defend their own value and personal justice against those who sought to diminish them. The journey was long and painful, but standing here in the light of my own truth was the greatest victory I could ever achieve for myself. Before we wrap up today's story, don't leave just yet, because the following perspective might just help you change your mindset regarding toxic relationships. As the host, I believe that family is not a free pass for anyone to trample on your self-respect and hard work. Forgiveness only holds value when it is earned and placed in the right context. Sometimes the most severe punishment you can give is simply removing your presence from their lives entirely. Always establish clear financial and emotional boundaries, even with your own relatives, to protect your self-worth. Independence and intelligence are the most powerful weapons you have to stand firm against deception and contempt. If you were in Sydney's shoes, would you choose to cut ties completely, or would you find it in your heart to forgive a family like that? If you have a different or more practical way to handle this, please let us know in the comments below. I truly appreciate and thank you for listening to Sydney's story until the very last second. Your perspectives and personal experiences are incredibly valuable to our community. Don't forget to hit the like button and share if you found this story meaningful. I look forward to seeing you all again in our next high-stakes drama scripts. Stay strong.